Computer. Okay, good morning to everybody. Good afternoon at Shanghai, I'm guessing. Welcome all to this meeting of the Xiaoting University's Department of International Relations talk series, Talks on the World in Crisis. Today we have Dr. Xiaoting Li from East China Normal University, and he is going to talk to us about Chinese foreign policy reacts to a world in crisis. Dr. Çağdaş Üngör from Marmara University will be the discussant. Dr. Xiaoting Li is an associate professor at the School of International and Area Studies at East China Normal University in Shanghai. He holds a doctorate in political science from the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign. He was actually my academic sibling. We had the same cohort, same advisor. His research interests include international relations theory, especially its adaptations in the non-Western context, Chinese foreign policy, and the transformation of international order in the post-Western era. He has published academic articles on foreign policy analysis, international interactions, international relations of Asia-Pacific, the Journal of Contemporary China, and recently, International Studies Review. Congratulations for that.
Yes.
Let me also introduce a bit Dr. Üngör. Dr. Çağdaş Üngör is a professor at Marmara University's Department of Political Science and International Relations in Istanbul, Turkey. She received her PhD from the History Department at the State University of New York, I can never say that correctly, Binghamton, I'm sorry, with a specialty in Chinese modern history. She holds a bachelor's degree in international relations from the Middle East Technical University and an MA degree in cultural studies from Istanbul Bilgi University. Her research interests include modern Chinese history, media and propaganda studies, Sino-Turkish exchanges, and international relations in East Asia. So without any further ado, Dr. Li, the floor is yours. Thank you all for coming.
And I'd like to extend my thanks to my old cohort, Konstantinos, and for his kind invitation, which made this event possible. And it's always good to talk to an old classmate of mine and also to know some new colleagues in Turkey. And actually, when we talk about a world in crisis, I think that from the standpoint of IR theory, a world in crisis also means simultaneously that the U.S. hegemony is in crisis because the post-Cold War the post Second World War and especially the post-Cold War international order has always been characterized by the U.S. hegemony or the dominance of the United States in international order. And this traditionally, I think that a hegemon, in this case, the United States, is expected to undertake a multitude of international responsibilities to maintain a well-functioning international system or international order. And these international responsibilities typically include the provision of public goods or the preservation of international stability across the world, and are the strengthening of international institutions to provide our predictability for the management of international affairs. So, if a hegemon is doing a good job in providing providing public goods, in enhancing international institutions, or in maintaining international stability, then we would say that this hegemon is a responsible one, and it deserves its dominant position in the international order. However, if the hegemon is not, undertaking these responsibilities and is actually, withdrawing from extricating itself from these international responsibilities, then this hegemon is not only committing a grave error of irresponsibility or incompetence, it is also putting the well-being of the international system at risk. So this is why I think that the current world or the current international system is in crisis. And it has less to do with, say, the rising powers than with the hegemon itself. And also, when the hegemon is not doing a good job in undertaking its own responsibilities, that would create opportunities for its competitors, potential competitors and real competitors as well, to step in and to demonstrate to the rest of the world that they can manage better than the hegemon. They can do better than the hegemon, say, are in contributing to global governance and are in providing for the well-being of the international system. And theoretically, of course, to compete with the hegemon effectively, the rising powers also have to draw some useful lessons from the hegemon. This is why I said that they have to, this is why I call it a successful emulating our strategy. What requires the rising powers to provide public goods, to preserve international stability, and to strengthen international institutions, because these are the very ways that make the international system work. And so in order to do better than the hegemon, the rising powers would have to, first of all, learn from the hegemon's good governance strategy. And within this context, the contemporary Chinese foreign policy is easily understandable. What do I mean by that? Well, if you look at Chinese foreign policy over the last decades, especially since the 2008 and 2009 in global financial crisis, which also marked the beginning of the relative decline of the US as a hegemon, you can see that Chinese foreign policy generally has been following the direction that I have just described. And it's not just a question with China. It's also a question with other rising powers like Russia and India and Indonesia, Korea or something, and even Turkey, of course. Regional powers like Turkey and Brazil and South Africa are all doing their part, or all staking out their separate claims in global governance. Why so? Because they all feel that the hegemon is no longer doing a proper job in managing the international order. And so what exactly has China been doing these days? Number one, well, if you look at, say, China's record of providing for public goods, you will find that, especially since the Chinese President Xi Jinping came to power, he emphasizes that China should begin to make a greater contribution to global governance in order to show that China is a responsible and a trustworthy power. And in this regard, China's Belt and Road Initiative is already a well-known case. So I'm not going to dwell upon that in greater detail. You can easily find a huge amount of literature research on this subject already. But here, I would just like to point out an often neglected fact. That is, actually starting with 2018, China has already replaced the US as the world's largest market for international exports. What does that mean? That means more countries in this world nowadays are exporting more goods to China than to the US. In other words, a close trading and economic relationship with China nowadays matters more to an ordinary developing country's economic well-being than its relationship with the US. So in this sense, this probably marks the beginning of China's overtaking of the US in providing international or public goods in terms of, say, the promotion of our common development or economic prosperity, shared economic prosperity across the world. And also, if you look at, say, China's track record of promoting free trade zones, you will find that China has recently made considerable progress in signing free trade agreements with our increasing number of countries, big, small, and medium. So in this sense, I believe that China has the potential in the next 10 years to overtake the US as the world's chief, or at least leading provider of public goods in terms of, especially in terms of our economic prosperity. And secondly, if you look at say China's record of, say, whether China record of being a stabilizing instead of a destabilizing our power in international affairs, I think that most neutral observers agree that whereas the U.S. has probably done more to destabilize the global and global and regional affairs in the last decade, China has actually done nothing to disturb regional stability in major corners of the world. And instead, China has been increasing its own efforts to contribute to regional stability. It is certainly true that China still has a few territorial disputes with some of its neighboring countries, but it is often forgotten that China's track record of settling territorial disputes with its neighbors is quite good, because most of China's territorial disputes are settled peacefully and with China making more concessions to its counterparts, rather than vice versa. And this is not based on my own research. This is based upon the research of a major American expert who is teaching at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, whose name is, say, Taylor Fravel. He's generally considered to be the world's leading expert on China's territorial disputes. And the conclusions that I just cite are drawn from his book. So, and also, if you ask, for instance, China's Central Asian neighbors, and I think that none of them will complain about China's high-handedness, say, handling, say, disputes with them. Instead, I think that they probably would have nice things to say about, say, how China provides a useful counterweight to Russian influence in Central Asia, which enabled those Central Asian countries to successfully maintain their independence instead of, say, submitting unilaterally to Russian pressures. So it's always the old question of, say, this is the Asian proverb, an East Asian proverb, that is, when the two elephants fight, the grassland will suffer. So the ants and the deers would suffer, something like that. So, but the converse side of this proverb is, of course, that in order to prevent this catastrophe, the ants and the deers would have a big stake in keeping the two elephants from fighting each other. Instead, they would like to engage each elephant on constructive terms to ensure that that they will contribute to the welfare of the grassland. So sorry for my complicated metaphor, but I think you already get what I mean. And also, when a dispute is difficult to settle at present, China's approach has traditionally been to maintain the status quo, to wait for a better time for both sides to make reasonable concessions to each other. And this is why I think that China's approach to the South China Sea dispute is often misunderstood, because our traditional, so much Western reporting on the South China Sea wrongly claims that China wants sovereignty over the entire South China Sea. But this is actually not China's position at all. China's position is only that it claims sovereignty over the islands in the South China Sea, but it does not rule out the possibility of our reaching a reasonable agreement over the distribution of fishing and maritime rights among the various countries on an equal and equitable basis. And this is why China is negotiating a binding code of conduct with other countries, with other regional countries, in order to maintain the stability and to ensure shared interests in the South China Sea recently. And I hope that this negotiation would bear fruit as soon as possible, because if this negotiation can be successfully brought to an end, it will say so much more about China, how China is actually keeping its word, keeping its good faith, in wanting a peaceful and in wanting a fair and a just settlement of a long drawn out dispute. And finally, as I said, if a rising power has to show that it can do better than the hegemon, to enhance our international predictability by supporting the building of international institutions. Unfortunately, so far, most international institutions in this world are still dominated by the West. Therefore, it is not easy to extract concessions from those Western powers, to request an increase in the voice and the representation of the non-Western countries in those Western-dominated institutions. Therefore, China, like many other rising states like India and Russia, is also hedging its bets. What do I mean? I mean that China is also setting up alternative international institutions just as a backup. But we should notice that in setting up those alternative international institutions, China so far, at least so far, has never asked for a predominant voice or veto power in those institutions. Instead, China has consistently made clear that it welcomes multilateral cooperation and contributions from other states. And I think that the AIIB, that is the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, is a good case in point. When it was started 4, 5, or 6 years ago, the AIIB was typically described by Western news media as a smokescreen for the expansion of China's influence. But if you look at the AIIB's track record of making decisions, you will find that China actually does not play a predominant role in the decision-making of AIIB at all, because the decision-making was based upon consensus instead of based on what does not depend on China's veto power, because China has no veto power at all. I think that by doing so, China is actually trying to show the world that it does not intend to impose its own voice or its own rules upon its partners or allies or the rest of the world. Instead, it is willing to address other countries' concerns by, say, giving up some of the traditional privileges or prerogatives that are attributed to a leading rising power. Okay, so much praise for Chinese foreign policy, but now I think that I'm also bound as a neutral academic to say a few words about the potential problems that lie ahead with Chinese foreign policy. This is just my purely academic point of view. And I think that there are generally three big problems that await Chinese foreign policy, or indeed the foreign policy of any major rising state in this world. Number one is that, like any other country with a long history or with an ancient civilizational tradition, or with, say, national pride in its resurgence, China is a very proud and a touchy nation, very touchy at some times, unfortunately. And it does not like to be lectured at by foreign countries, especially about how it should run its domestic and international affairs. However, from a purely academic point of view, I'd like to stress that no country in this world is perfect or infallible. Therefore, how to learn useful lessons from international criticisms, it will always be a big question for a rising power like China or Russia or India to grapple with. Because ultimately, it is only from criticisms that we learn about our true strengths and weaknesses. If there is no criticism, I'm afraid it lapse into a self-congratulatory mood and refuse to, say, address its own limitations or inadequacies at all. So that is the first major problem that I see, waits in store for China. And the second problem is that, as a huge country, China has made impressive progress in developing its national economy. However, as a huge country, China has great regional disparities in its own national development. If you have visited China, and possibly if you have, say, visited China's rural areas, you will be able to find that some areas in China are impressively rich, surprisingly wealthy, whereas there are also some other regions that are dismally backward or strikingly poor. Well, I'm not lying, because the Chinese government admits as much. The Chinese government always points out that China is still a developing country. If you measure China's economic growth by per capita terms. So there is still a domestic debate going on within China, not just within the Chinese government, but also among the ordinary Chinese people as well, about how much China should really contribute to global governance. Because every resource diverted from domestic development it's doubtful that when, let's say, China still has so much to desire in terms of its domestic construction, China has to contribute to divert its resources from domestic to international purposes. So whether China would, say, undertake more international responsibilities is not just nowadays, is not just the concern of the Chinese government. It's also the concern of the Chinese people at large, and even, say, a seemingly authoritarian government like the Chinese government cannot totally ignore public opinion these days. And this possibly would constrain China's willingness to and the capacity for our contributions to our global governance in the future. And finally, I think that our international relations theory tells us that there is no certainty of other countries' intentions. Therefore, whatever China says about its good intentions or about its good faith regarding international relations or regarding global governance I'm afraid that there will always be countries that regard China with fear and suspicion. And this is perfectly understandable. I mean, for international scholars, international relations scholars like us. However, I mean, no country would like to say, since the Chinese government has spoken so frequently about the good intentions, it actually has unwittingly set up a rhetorical trap for itself. That is, other countries will naturally say look upon China with possibly higher expectations. That is, they would expect China to act with more generosity, with more, say, moderation, with less narrow self-interest in handling international affairs. But this, unfortunately, cannot be and will not be the case, always be the case. And so this raises a large question of how China would deal with, say, its multitude of disagreements or disputes with individual countries in the future. Possibly some would argue that yes, as I do, China would in East Asian culture, losing face is a big problem. If you do not keep your word, you lose your face, and this will be a great problem for you. And so my argument has always been that since China has liked to spoken of itself as, say, the supporter of fairness and justice in international relations, it has to live up to its promise. But then, as I said, public opinion nowadays also matters greatly in China. And whether public opinion would allow the Chinese government to make too much concessions or insensitive disputes will be a big problem. And this problem, I think, that has already been felt by the Chinese government in managing, say, its maritime disputes with Japan and with the South in the South China Sea. And how this will be managed in the future, honestly, I have no idea. But I can only say that I hope, from the point of view of an IR scholar, that not just China, but China's potential contenders can all learn a lesson from history. That is, it's always a good thing to test to appear tough and try to appear tough as a good way of inducing concessions from your contenders. But on the other hand, it's an even greater testimony to your statecraft by showing that you are pragmatic and flexible, or to use Hans Morgenthau's old saying, prudence, or the weighing of alternative political actions, is a supreme virtue in international politics. And I hope that not just China, but many other countries in the world, including the US, of course, can also bear this virtue of prudence in mind when they approach sensitive disputes. Okay, so I think that this is already 30 minutes. And Konstantinos, do you want me to?
Yeah, I mean, you still have like 3 minutes if you want to use them, but if you want to stop here, that's fine. It's up to you, Xiaoting.
Okay.
So you want to stop here and we go to the discussant?
Yes, I think that I would like to hear or listen more to the discussions and to answering people's questions. Yes.
Okay. Dr. Üngör, then it is your turn. Thank you very much, Xiaoting. Thank you very much for the
yes, you're welcome.
Presentation. Okay, so how many minutes should I give Dr. Üngör, Denise? 10, 15 minutes? Sorry.
We said 10 to 15. So.
Okay, excellent. Okay, then the floor is yours, Dr. Üngör.
Okay, well, first of all, thanks for having me. I didn't say that in the beginning, I think. Anyway, the concept of hegemony, international hegemony, I mean, talking about great powers. Of course, this is a country where you have a very strong anti-American sentiment. So we understand what's wrong with American hegemony. There are so many sins to, American power and what has been going on, at least since the 1990s, since United States was left alone as a, more or less as a, one and only country, hegemon that we have. There's, of course, so much talk about multilateralism, multipolar world, emerging countries, and China, of course, has been a very good example of that, perhaps the primary country that everyone has been focused on in the last 20, 30 years. And there are certain things, obviously, that has been caused by American hegemony or American unilateralism. And most recently, of course, we have seen this. I think for the worst part, we have seen it with the Trump administration, especially during the coronavirus crisis and such acts like, the withdrawal from American withdrawal from the World Health Organization, etc. These are just the examples that Professor Li talked about. I mean, in terms of a great powers contribution or lack thereof for these institutional mechanisms, global governance, etc. So I agree to a great extent that United States was not doing a good job about that. So coming to the question of what China or any other alternative hegemon can do better, and there are certain things, of course, that has been achieved by the coercive power of U.S. hegemony. I mean, Americans acting, through the use of force, they have been doing as they liked in several regions, including, Iraq and Afghanistan, the most recent examples. And we have really seen them becoming failures. Even the most pro-American, pro-establishment experts think of them as failures. But there is also the other element, very important element to hegemony or any understanding of great power. Who has ever been a hegemon, a global hegemon, since, the 17th century, okay? And that part is about consent, generating consent, because yes, we may be very, very critical about the American power, doing as they liked, taking all these unilateral, acts all over the place. But let's face it, Americans did not rule and did not become, the US did not really become a hegemon through the use of force. Not exclusively anyway. Okay, there is that element of consent generation, appeal, a model, a political regime, something like a system to promote, okay, promise all around the world for individual countries. And that, at the very basis of it, there is the idea of democracy. Okay, this is like when we are talking about United States, of course, we should always be talking about racism, Black Lives Matter, etc., very recent manifestations. We should always be talking about the bad things as well, right? I'm not claiming that, United States have been an exemplary democracy, but we are talking about its international influence and the spirit that it's getting across, the message, okay? The American dream. Now the Chinese have their own dream. Since 2013, I believe, Xi Jinping has devised this new idea of national regeneration, the welfare, the Chinese society aspiring to become a more prosperous society, a relatively well-off society, middle class rising in China, etc. Okay, so you have these counterparts, but And again, criticizing something, being against something is always easier than generating something new. Okay, I mean, talking about anti-Americanism, I can gather in this group people of conservative origin, Muslim conservatives. I can bring together the nationalists, Turkish nationalists. I can bring together the left-wing people. All of us. I mean, we can point out several aspects of anti-American sentiment, etc. But if we try discussing, for instance, what should the new global governance or international system or the economic system, okay, the international structure should look like, we will all have, a wide array of differences. Okay, I mean, very few of us could I guess, reach a consensus on that. And here, having been observing China for the last 20 years or so in my personal life, I have always, this question always bugged me. What would an imaginary, for instance, international society, globe, an alternative globe under the hegemony of China would look like? I'm not saying China is aspiring to become a hegemon or trying to use like coercive means to achieve that, etc. Hypothetically speaking, because what I have been seeing lacking in China is that idea. I mean, there's a talk of China model since 2008 financial crisis, right? What we understand from China, of course, China model is not something devised by, the term itself was not devised by Xi Jinping or, like anyone in China. These are like Western concepts. Nevertheless, we understand why it became popular, because 2008 economic crisis, you have the neoliberal prescriptions, Washington consensus, big failure, right? Even for the capitalist people, like all these CEOs in financial institutions, big business, Wall Street, right? It failed. So people discussing China model, looking at China as an economic miracle and discussing what China did right instead of what, I don't know, Mexico, Argentina, etc., all these developing countries following the neoliberal ideas failed. Okay, and what is the China model about? It's about government involvement in economy, and let's face it, it's an authoritarian model. No democracy, no Western style parliament, presidential system at site. Okay, so a little bit of authoritarianism at home, a little bit of government involvement, but all the way, market economy as well. And when you check the Gini coefficients, for instance, in the US and China, you see quite a resemblance, right? In terms of economic inequality within the country, within China and the US, they indeed are very similar, right? This is not Mao Zedong China anymore, right? This is a market economy, very big gap between regions, between urban and, rural centers, between people, migrant workers, and I don't know, urban engineers, etc., middle class people. So the economic model is not that different. Yes, there is government involvement, floating exchange rate doesn't exist, etc. But in terms of, what it feels like to people at home or abroad, looking at the China model, it's not, in terms of generating inequality, etc. It's not really that different. It's not socialism of the 1960s, where, for instance, a private in the army got, around the same salary with a general, right? No big difference between the two salaries back then. So you don't really have that. And what do you have instead? You have Confucius institutes, cultural diplomacy, but is Confucianism really something that other people can buy around the world? We have 4 Confucius institutes in Turkey. Yes, people like to speak Chinese, learn Chinese. A lot of people aspire to study the language, look for business opportunities in China, but does Confucianism really appeal to anyone? Or what other cultural exports or the appealing factor, the consent generation. When I look at China in terms of consent, I see the, well, Belt and Road Initiative. And what is that? Is that really, I mean, it's appealing, but is it soft power appeal? Or is it like, we are going to come to your country and invest, and we'll bring in the cash and build the bridges here or the schools? I mean, it's appealing, but it's not really the appeal that an alternative model or system, political regime type, or values and rules, and in that sense, can generate. So that aspect of American hegemony, I see lacking, and that's going to be my I guess the first question to open this up for debate, because nobody contests the idea that, you know, China is growing economically, and in many respects, I believe Chinese contribute to global governance in terms of all these institutional mechanisms, etc. At least in the recent years. You know, they have a favorable, of course, role in that. I mean, nobody disputes that, especially when you have somebody like Donald Trump. I mean, it's, I guess, easier to shine, right, for Xi Jinping. Anyway, that's going to be my opening up, I guess, statement, and we can hear more maybe from Dr. Li.
Konstantinos?
I'm muted. Thank you so much, Dr. Üngör. Dr. Li, would you like to answer a bit to Dr. Ünger's points, and then we'll start going into the Q&A?
Yes.
By the way, everybody, if you want to ask a question, please write it in the chat, and I'll collect them and ask them from the students, especially. I'll ask them directly. The professors, you can ask also if you want directly through the speech. But now you can talk to Dr. Ünger's interesting points, I think, and then we'll go into the Q&A.
Yes, definitely. I thank Professor Üngör very much for your astute observations on China. It's really challenging to answer to your questions. Since you are a China expert, you are definitely a China expert with a much wider grasp of China or knowledge about China than many I meet in the United States. So first of all, let me try to summarize the areas of agreement between you and me. Actually, I agree with a lot that you said. First of all, I agree that anti-Americanism is not a good substitute for global governance. That is, we are all free to criticize the US hegemony, but the real question for non-Western countries, non-Western intellectuals, and non-Western leaders is really whether they can come up with a better and a working alternative. So this is the first impression that I get from your observations. And with that point, I'm in complete agreement. That is, I agree that not just China, but many other non-Western rising states are not at this moment coming up with a better and a working alternative, or whether this alternative is in our global governance or even in domestic governance. No, I don't think that so far we really have a working alternative, a better and a working alternative yet. And China is no exception from this point. And secondly, I agree with you that China is still in the process of generating its soft power. China does not have, strictly speaking, does not have much soft power abroad yet. I'm in total agreement with you on this point. And the reasons for this might be very complex, because in the last, since Mao Zedong established the People's Republic of China in 1949, it actually took China more than 60 years to lift are the majority of its population out of poverty. That is, it is only by the early 2000s that the Chinese government can confidently claim that the majority of the country's population have already said goodbye to poverty. And it is only in the last year that the Chinese government under Xi Jinping makes the final declaration that now even the small minority of the Chinese population who has remained trapped in poverty, or poverty by Chinese standards, are now finally moved themselves forward. They no longer belong to the technical category of poverty in China. So, since China has had to concentrate so much upon its domestic development in the last 6 to 8 decades, it's not really surprising that China has little energy left for thinking about how to improve its international image, or how to contribute to global governance, or how to craft a better and working alternative to US hegemony. I would argue that it is only in the most recent decade, under President Xi Jinping's leadership, that the Chinese government and the Chinese intellectual circles at large begin to think about this issue seriously. But I think that China is a quick learner. Actually, I think that we are always good at learning lessons from the past, from the present, and from abroad. Therefore, I think that this problem, China might come up with its own solutions to the problems that I just described in terms of the production of soft power, maybe in the next decade. And I'm certainly curious to see what would come up, say, in the next decade, though I have no idea how China is going to expand its soft power so far. But I think that China still venerates Marxist ideology. And a basic tenet of Marxist ideology is that the economic growth would provide a viable basis for intellectual development, political, intellectual, and social development as well. So China might as well come up something better than what it can offer the world, or intellectually, or in terms of its development experience, in terms of the governance models, or things like that. And finally, regarding this notion of the China model, I'd like to point out that the Chinese government has never used that term in its official statements. That is, again, according to President Xi Jinping himself, he openly declared after he came to power that the so-called process of reform and opening in China will never end. It's a never-ending and open-ended process, which means even if there will be a China model, or this China model will be characterized, first of all, by its flexibility, by its ever-changing flexibility, or by its willingness, if I can interpret this term more freely, or by China's willingness to learn everything good from other countries' experience and integrate this foreign experience into its own development. This is my understanding of President Xi's statement. So in that sense, the China model, I would argue that even if there in the future there will be a China model, it possibly would be characterized by not so much by its Chinese characteristics, but by the surprising combination of both Chinese and international characteristics, including, for instance, even Turkish characteristics. Who can say no? Because our China has always been a multicultural and multi-ethnic nation. And I think that even our Chinese government would freely admit with frankness that all ethnic nations in China have something good and useful to offer each other for the purposes of mutual learning. The Chinese government, at least officially, never claims that in China, there is one dominant nationality and that should just dictate to other smaller nationalities. At least officially, that's not the Chinese line. And the Chinese government always reminds the Chinese people that at least officially, of course, that even the smallest nationality may have something worthy to teach the big nationalities. So I would be curious to see how this commonly perceived China model would actually continue to evolve in the future. But personally, I think that there are several things that the Chinese government would always insist upon, in developing this idea of the so-called China model. That is, number one, there must be a strong central leadership in any transitional society. Because transitional societies usually has a multitude of growing pains, and without a central leadership, strong central leadership, it is very doubtful that a transitional society can just manage those growing pains purely by depending upon its societal forces. This is why I think that government involvement will always be a notable characteristic of the Chinese model or the Chinese development experience. And this does not mean that China would want to export its governance model to the rest of the world. But I think that I bring up this point again only as a debating point. I think that personally, it's not just my belief. This is also a belief shared by many Chinese intellectuals and a very sizable, if not a majority, of the segment of the Chinese population that are a huge transitional society cannot really succeed in its modernization or without a strong central leadership. And secondly, a strong central leadership also means that it has to make unwelcome decisions, and sometimes are very unpleasant decisions in matters of wherein a great national interest is at stake. And I think in this regard, China might, like other Eastern Asian countries, might benefit a lot from its Confucian traditions, because Confucian traditions emphasize that actually the state and individuals have mutual obligations toward each other. That is, the state, of course, has obligations to, provide for social welfare, to provide stability, and to promote our common development, something like that. But the individuals have obligations toward the state as well. That is, if the state is obviously acting with an eye to promote the general welfare, then the individuals are supposed to submit their individual their self-interest to the pursuit to place the pursuit of general welfare above the pursuit of their self-interest. And in this regard, I possibly shared our China's ways, traditional ways as well. And this is why, say, our China's experience cannot be exported, I believe, cannot be exported outside of East Asia at all, because the success of the China model, as I said, depend upon mutual obligations felt by the state and the individuals. And so when we talked about China's strong central leadership, we are easy to forget that this strong central leadership cannot really succeed without the strong sense of obligation shared by many of the Chinese people, or even the overwhelming majority of the Chinese people. And if you do not have this sense of mutual obligations between the state and the individuals, I think that the China model simply cannot be replicated. And this is why I think the Chinese government never claims that it has created a new development model for human society, because the Chinese leaders themselves know that China's success has unique cultural roots, cultural and social roots. Okay, so I hope that I have summarized both my agreement with you and also put in some of my own further thoughts on these matters.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much. So let's go to the Q&A. Dr.
Constantino?
Üngör? Yeah, can you hear me? Shouting?
Yes.
Okay, Dr. Üngör, do you want to add something, reply something
Well,
before we go to the Q&A?
Just maybe one statement. When I was talking about the lack of appeal, absence of like a soft power, general appeal or consent generation, I didn't mean it like a practical problem. I suspect that it might be an essential problem. And I think Dr. Li already pointed out that the Chinese experience may indeed be too culturally unique. I mean, everything with Chinese characters is not really an exportable idea. You got to drop the Chinese characters at some point. And I do hope that last characteristic may be a political one, perhaps. Maybe the CC.
Okay, so let me collect some of the Q&As that are in the chat and form them in questions, and then we'll open it up for direct questions. Okay, is that okay, Denise? I'll start with the chat Q&As, collecting them into sets.
Sure.
Okay, so there seem to be three types of questions that are coming in the Q&A, and I will say, okay, so the first one, a couple of them are just definition questions. One person asked, what's the definition of poverty in the People's Republics of China? You don't have to answer them immediately, by the way. You can note them down if you want. Another one asked, somebody asked, what's the definition of poverty in the People's Republic of China? Another question that was like definitional question is about the dual circulation policy that recently President Xi Jinping talked about. Then there are a number of questions that are talking about China's economic foreign policy and dispute management policy, okay? And when it comes to the economic policy, there are general questions how does China's policy differ from the US and European policy towards, support for the economies of other states in Africa and Asia? And what's the role of debt in that? Okay, because recently, for example, Imran Khan from Pakistan essentially praised the Chinese government for its efforts in alleviating poverty in China, but also pointed out that the Chinese policy of support through debt, the BRI, through loans without strings might actually be detrimental. And talking about debt, I also would like you to touch about the role of debt inside Chinese society, since it seems in many news that there is a ballooning personal debt at the level of the society. Then there are the questions that have to do with mostly with the South China Sea issue. And I will translate those questions as following. The way I think, I see it, Dr. Lito's point, and I'm not a specialist in China, is that China sometimes behaves like Russia and sometimes behaves like the US, in the sense that Russia is very clear about what parts of the international order it cares about and defends. So, for example, the right, the sovereignty of states, non-intervention, territorial integrity, except when it doesn't. And of course, the US also was similar in that sense. And sometimes China seems to behave in that sense, non-intervention, absolute sovereignty. And sometimes in the South Sea issue, for example, it puts forward the need for a regional understanding that will create a legal condition that is separate from the global condition, which is UNCLOS. UNCLOS has become essentially an element of the global international law. So I would like you to talk a bit more, and I think the students are interested to understand, how can China square the circle, and every great power has to do it because all of them are a la carte. Russia is like that, US is like that. How can China square the circle between, on the one part, saying certain, principles of the international system as created after 1945? I don't like the term liberal order and stuff like that. Let's say the international system as created after 1945 have global importance and should be defended. And certain other principles need to be given, if you want, regional specifications. And I think in the law of the sea, that's the most important case. And finally, one last question. The issue that's going on in China with the Uyghur minority, it's a big issue in Turkey. Of course, it's a big issue worldwide. It's a bit of a PR disaster, I think, for China, but we don't have to discuss too much about that. I think that one interpretation is discussing about the regional differences you said that China still has between regions. And I'm going to ask this. If a regional issue with a sparsely populated region like the Xinjiang region creates so much tension and trouble for China, don't you think that it might be even more dangerous if a more populous region would lead to like tensions because of regional differences? And as you know, Dr. John Mearsheimer, you know Mearsheimer well as I know, he always says that China's rise is essentially going to break on essentially these regional differences, that it's not going to be able to overcome these regional issues. That's where essentially the retraction is going to happen. So those are the 3 points that I think all of the questions really wander around. Some definitional questions, the question about the trade, BRI policy, the role of debt in the Chinese economy and its relations with the developing world. How does China square the circle between its claim to uphold some universalist elements of the post-1945 order, sovereignty, non-intervention, and at the same time on other places questioning universalist elements like UNCLOS. UNCLOS does not apply in the South China Sea. We have to come together and come to an agreement. And third, the regional differences and how they might undermine China's foreign policy in the future. And finally, you pointed out about consensus, but I want to remind you, this is my little sticky thing. Consensus is a veto system. Don't forget that, essentially. Thank you. So those are the questions from the chat. After that, everybody else can ask questions freely.
Oh, okay. Our Constantinos are, so the first 2 definitional questions, one is about poverty. Another one is about do what? I did not
dual
get
circulation system, dual double circulation. I looked it up and I looked it up and Reuters had a piece, and it's something that Xi Jinping said recently, that he will have an internal circulation economy supported by an external.
Oh, I see. This is already a question of a bad translation. Okay, I see. Okay, yes, I'm happy to answer the definitional questions first. First, poverty in China is a question measured by purely Chinese standards. My understanding is that, say, if a family has only a monthly income of, like, say, 300 Chinese yuan, which means, let me see, which means a dismal income of, let's see, like maybe $50. If a family only has a monthly income of $50, that counts as poverty in China. And it needs government involvement to help those families to move forward, to help them find, say, better means of employment, to help them find better ways of, say, doing business, or to just to move them forward, move them away from such Chinese definition categories of poverty. So that is my understanding. But this is a very crude Chinese measure. It's not an international measure. I'm quite sure about that. And secondly, the so-called dual circulation system. This is purely a mistranslation, I would argue. Mr. Xi Jinping's, what Mr. President Xi means is that China, in the past, China has basically adopted an export-oriented strategy of economic growth. That is, China exports a lot of goods abroad and use the foreign currency earned to develop its national economy later. But nowadays, China has already, say, successfully developed it raised its national economy to a higher level. And China already has a large domestic market with a huge population of middle-class consumers. Therefore, in the future, China would actually try to, say, produce more products, more goods for its domestic consumers. That is, China would depend upon both domestic and international markets for its economic welfare in the future. And this term should be translated as dual dependence system instead of dual circulation system. Dual dependence means dependence upon both domestic and international markets. So these are the definitional questions. And secondly, how China's economic foreign policy is affecting the welfares of other states, or in comparison with, say, the US and the EU practices. And so far, I have to say that I don't have much concrete data to support any reasonable conclusions. But I would like to direct your attention to an interesting article published by two American scholars at the famous American journal, The Atlantic. You can search Atlantic China's debt trap for more information. I think that article actually calls the so-called debt trap, Chinese debt trap, into question. It basically says that much Western reporting on the debt trap China creates for poorer countries is a gross exaggeration. Actually, if you look deeper into those specific cases, you will find invariably that there are no such debt traps at all, or at least those so-called debt traps are no more serious than the ones that are already created by the US and the EU lenders for those poorer countries. So I'd like to direct your attention to that interesting US academic article for your own intellectual curiosity. And also, you mentioned about, say, how China, say, whether China is more like US or Russia in defending its sovereign rights, and how that might, say, compare with China's lip service to some universal principles of fairness or justice. Well, on this point, unfortunately, I have to say that even international law is quite ambiguous on this question. And I really cannot say for sure that, say, what is really how a lot would depend upon how we exactly define such terms of justice or fairness under international law. And our one man's meat might buy another man's poison, as the English proverb goes. So in this sense, I think that what China needs to do, honestly, is to say train an army of international lawyers in China and let them handle those issues are on China's behalf, instead of having the Chinese government coming to the fore every time, as if the Chinese government is the sole defender of China's sovereign rights. Actually, I believe that many Chinese people have strong feelings of China's sovereign rights as well, and they just don't have sufficient technical knowledge of how, international law would provide a justification for, would stand against such claims of sovereign rights. So I think that our scholars of IR, are not necessarily experts on those technical issues. So again, I would like to direct your attention to an interesting our journal. Unfortunately, I forgot the journal's name, but you can easily search for it. In China, there is a think tank called South China Sea Research Institute, China. And this research think tank is unofficial. It's a quasi-official, not official, but semi-official or quasi-official. But this think tank maintains a good collaboration with our international lawyers in Europe and the US. And just last year, I think this think tank publishes an interesting collection of research articles in collaboration of EU and US scholars and international lawyers on the merits and demerits of China's sovereign claims in the South China Sea. So it provides a very frank and fair assessment of China's claims, which I consider a good sign, which means that China nowadays has begun to realize that it has to base its perceptions and claims on internationally recognized standards or codes or something like legal codes or something like that. But since I'm not an expert in this area, I would like to direct your attention to that collection of articles. Just to search for the South China Sea Research Institute, China. And I'm sure that you will find the internet link to the collection of articles that I just mentioned. But again, I think that every great power would insist upon its vital interests. For instance, the South China Sea, I believe that the distribution of the fishing and maritime rights will be a negotiable matter for China. But if you say that China does not have sovereignty over the islands in the South China Sea, I think that argument would go too far in challenging China's vital interests. And I think that honestly, not only the Chinese government, but possibly the majority of the Chinese people would oppose such frontal challenges to China's sovereign interests or sovereign claims. And also, Konstantinos, I think what's the last question? Sorry, I forgot. I think I covered most of them.
Yeah, the last question was about the Xinjiang issue, as maybe an example of the regional differences that you pointed out. You talked about regional differences, economic differences in China.
Yes.
And what I asked is if Xinjiang is an example of how these regional differences can get out of hand with a less populated part of China, what would happen if a more populated region got into this kind of trouble because of the regional differences? Because some American professors, Mersheim, for example, believe that it's this regional differences in economic development that are going to undermine China long term. And it does seem, at least the Xinjiang problem, the Uyghur problem, seems to be a bad portent about how powerful these issues can be in weakening China's hand and creating trouble, both domestically and internationally.
Yes, frankly, I think that the current Western reporting on Xinjiang, again, is grossly exaggerated. And I visited Xinjiang in 2016 and frankly, as a private tourist, I went to several parts of Xinjiang, and honestly, I never saw any sign of the so-called ethnic revolt or ethnic unrest or in the places that I visit as a private tourist. I'm not saying that what I saw in Xinjiang is absolutely, or say, the only truth about Xinjiang. But I'm only saying that the situation in Xinjiang is definitely not as bad as, say, much of the Western news reporting would have us believe. But that said, you are right. Xinjiang actually is an ethnically mixed region. And the Uyghurs actually has, like, say, my majority are in the local population. The Hans and the other minor the nationalities also have, the Uyghurs possibly have, if I remember correctly, the Uyghurs have, like, say, 60%, take up 60% of the population, whereas the Hans and the minor nationalities together are comprised, like, 40% of the population. So it's not just a question of, say, the Han Chinese versus the Uyghurs. It's actually a more complicated and difficult questions. Are the Uyghurs and the other minor nationalities possibly, say, do not live very comfortably with each other either? So I think that this is why I argue that not just me, but possibly many ordinary Chinese agree with this point. That is precisely because the local situation is so complex, and, say, maybe there are so much latent tension in this region. This is why I believe that we need a strong central leadership for the double purposes of both maintaining the stability and for promoting our better, say, economic and inter-ethnic relations there. Because without the central government as a final arbiter, you can simply forget about the prospect of healthy inter-ethnic relations there. Well, I think that the former Yugoslavia is a good example. The ethnic violence did not stop with the disintegration of the Yugoslavia, or say with the disintegration of the Soviet Union. Actually, the disintegration of Yugoslavia and the Soviet Union actually greatly exacerbated the local ethnic tensions. And finally, I think that what the Chinese government is doing in Xinjiang, honestly, nobody can be 100% sure about that. But I believe that the Chinese government is at least right on one thing. That is, poverty is the hotbed of religious fundamentalism. That is, if you say have no other, say, if you can see no hope for your life, naturally you would look up to some higher spiritual guidance. And possibly, I'm not saying that this is the only reason for religious fundamentalism, but I think that the Chinese government certainly believes that. And I suspect that it is very much likely the truth, or that this is why the Chinese people argue, the Chinese government argues that actually in order to, the best way to fight religious fundamentalism or extremism or terrorism in Xinjiang is not to say suppress, say the terrorists per se, but to find the local population more means of employment, or teach them more ways to make a better living, so that, or say, they would not be so easily attracted by religious fundamentalism. Or that is at least the understanding shared by many ordinary Chinese like me.
Okay, the next, thank you. The next question is for Dr. Üngör. Okay, Dr. Üngör, one of the participants is asking, do you think that BRI is known well in the Turkish public? Many people I talk think that it is nothing more than a debt trap. Also, a significant amount of Turkish IR experts think so, maybe because they follow just Western sources, but it's more than that. I think China have a very low profile in Turkey in terms of public policy. I don't know why. Think of the latest issue, the case, the embassy. What will be a change in China's strategy in this regard? So this is a question for the discussant, Xiaoting. Dr. Üngör, please, the floor is yours.
That's a couple of questions together, I think. First, I agree with Dr. Li on the question of debt trap. Debt trap, yes, certainly some of the countries that China helped with, I mean, gave loans or did investment in, etc. Some of them couldn't pay it back, okay? But the main responsibility and fault, whatever that is, lies with the local governments, okay? China invests everywhere, from Iceland to, I don't know, Mozambique. So it's the local government, their inability and wrong policy making, okay? So let's not take the blame out of local governments. I think that's what the Western media is doing and doing wrong. So we are now talking about Kanal Istanbul and Chinese investment, right? I mean, if it doesn't turn out to be a financially viable investment, I mean, is it going to be the Chinese company's fault after all? I mean, so the main responsibility, I think, lies with the local governments who are making those decisions. And Western sources about the BRI, I think experts, specialists, IR people generally know about BRI, but I think the problem with BRI in Turkey is not that it is not known widely, or it's like under exaggerated, but I think the opposite is the case. It's probably over exaggerated, because when you think about Chinese investment, Chinese BRI related investment in Turkey, in comparison with Chinese investment, for instance, in other Middle Eastern countries, you will see that it's not really a substantial partner. It's not like the significant partner that it, I mean, actually people like pro-government media or think tanks promote. I mean, in terms of numbers, and I'm talking about actual investment here, and the projects, the long-term proposals. So there is so much talk about the BRI in Turkey, but not as much investment to justify that much talk. That's my impression. What's the third question?
I think that was the question. Is like they said that what can China do, or will China change its strategy in the regard of its image in Turkey? They raised the issue of the embassy recently, for example.
Well, there are so many cultural, historical, ideological, etc. reasons for anti-China sentiment in Turkey. I have personally studied this very briefly, I mean, not in an extensive way, but Cold War politics get into it, okay? The fact that China was a communist country and we were together with the United States and NATO, right? That plays a part. Second issue, the historical ideas like nationalism, Turkish nationalism, the whole ancient links with Central Asian tribes and Turkic nomadic culture, okay? The early Republican historiography concerning the roots of Turkey and was there when we were in Central Asia? China, next door. And apparently we were enemies, not great friends. I mean, we were friendly as well, but that part is not emphasized. So history textbooks talk about the Great Wall built against the Turks. And if we learn it that way, what can you do? I mean, there's a lot of anti-China sentiment. And of course, the Uyghur problem, contemporary issues play into it as well. Besides all that, there is very stereotypical kind of cultural biases. Chinese food, even before the coronavirus, it was a problem for us, right? They eat everything in quotation marks. Like that's the impression, that's the perception of Chinese food. And lots of other stereotypes about the Chinese culture. So there is a lot of anti-China sentiment. I don't think it's because the Chinese are not really doing good public diplomacy in Turkey, but it's because of the, local dynamics. And the embassy tweet obviously added to it and exacerbated it to a great extent. If you have followed the social media a couple of weeks ago, I mean, there was a big uproar and a lot of anti-China sentiment coming along with that. So I really don't know what the Chinese representatives, like diplomatic circles, can do about this, but well, we don't really have, I mean, apparently the public, at least, there is a big difference, there is a big gap between the Turkish government understanding, vision on China, official perspective on China, and the public opinion. There is a big gap, and it's sometimes becoming a problem.
Thank you very much. Let's open it a bit to the people who might want to ask questions directly, especially the other departmental members. Any questions? Okay, let me then ask a question that Faik Gur, a member of our department, asked, and I want to ask this question both to Xiaoting, Dr. Li, and to Dr. Üngör. And he was asking about the idea of China's peaceful development policy, right? Especially this was much more of a central doctrine, at least in talk back in the years before Xi Jinping, right? And he was asking to maybe explain a bit what this means and what this means going forward, the whole idea of peaceful rise, peaceful development, and what does that mean forward for China, and what does that mean forward maybe for the region and the world. So I would like Dr. Li to first say something, and then Dr. Üngör, your view as well, if possible.
There is possibly a misunderstanding regarding this term, peaceful development. My understanding is that this peaceful development actually has a double meaning. On the one hand, it represents China's commitment to develop peacefully, to rise peacefully as a responsible great power. But on the other hand, it also has some unspoken assumptions. That is, the reason why China can rise peacefully as a responsible great power is that other countries, the international society at large, would also like to, welcome China's rise. So, if other countries, for instance, the US, do not welcome China's rise as a great power, then apparently the relations between China and those countries cannot be really peaceful. As you can see, in the case of today's US-China relations. So I think that this notion of peaceful development actually imposes obligations upon reciprocal obligations upon China and upon some other countries that are, for one reason or another, look upon China with fear or with hostility, something like that. So if my understanding is that if other countries want to ensure China's continued peaceful development, they probably should also reconsider their approach to China. That is, well, everybody knows that, say, if you keep treating me as an enemy, I will turn into an enemy for you. But if you keep treating me as a friend, even though, say, I suspect your motives sometimes, but overall, I might be gradually persuaded of your good intentions, and then try to readjust my approach towards you as well. So this is a reciprocal thing, I think, reciprocal commitment, I think.
Thank you. Dr. Üngör?
I think, well, peaceful development means, or Chinese economic development basically means different things to the Western world and the developing world. Non-Western world, of course, non-Western world is not a homogeneous block. I mean, we cannot really make overgeneralizations, but the developing world, which includes Turkey, does not really have the same kind of threat perception as the United States or Europe nowadays, the Western Hemisphere. So I think developing world is seeing more opportunity in China than threats. And that opportunity is usually the economic incentives, of course, FDI, maybe commercial networks, other things, infrastructure projects, etc. So, and we should, of course, remember here that before before the Chinese administration coined the term peaceful development, there was peaceful rise. And they had to fix it because it was too threatening for the rest of the world. Anyway, so peaceful development, I think that was a response to all the China threat discourse that was abundant in the US back in the 1990s. So they had to come up with something. But nevertheless, I would say this non-interference policy, like I don't interfere with your domestic politics. All I'm here for is the economic issues, like doing business. It's a win-win thing. Even if it doesn't work out, this is I think this is appealing to the developing world. Not perhaps in a soft power sense, not in an ideational or value, etc. That sense, but in pragmatic terms, that's very appealing for most of the developing world, I would say.
Thank you so much. Okay, let me open it again. Does anybody have any questions that I would ask to ask directly from the gallery?
I think there are 2 more questions in the chat box.
Yeah, I show them, but I think I can make them into a bigger question. But I wanted to see if anybody else wants to ask some other question before I go back to the, bigger catch-all questions, because it raises some interesting issues together with the discussion we just heard about peaceful rise, peaceful development. But I wanted to give a chance to somebody else before I try to connect them all. Okay, so let me grab that chat, because I think this is an interesting discussion over here about the peaceful rise and peaceful development. And some of the students have been asking about the tightening a bit of China's foreign policy on issues like Hong Kong autonomy, the issue with Taiwan. And at least my perspective as an IR scholar, Xiaoting, you can disagree, completely fine. You know the numbers, you study the numbers well, but my perspective has been that there has been a tightening compared to the past period. And, the answer you gave about peaceful development is easy. Is interesting, because I remember us discussing these issues back when we were both PhD students, in the US and everything. And the rhetoric then was more like China saying, we are going to be careful not to, with the peaceful rise idea, we're going to be careful not to step on anybody's toes during our rise, to avoid, scaring like Germany did in its rise and stuff like that. And the rhetoric as you expressed it now, and I think you're giving an accurate representation, is a bit different. I don't remember that conditional aspect that it will be peaceful if you treat us nice. And I wanted to ask, from a power transition perspective, and when I talk power transition, I do not mean Allison's cherry picking of history. We're talking about classical, hardcore, statistical, Jacek Kugler, Organsky power transition style. From a power transition perspective, partly the language that you used, which I think is accurate about the way that China is thinking about it, and this tightening of China's policy to places like Taiwan, like Hong Kong, kind of sounds like the language of dissatisfaction. And remember what Kugler-Organsky said: if you have power transition, but everybody's satisfied, then everything is fine. It's US, UK changing, there's no war, there's no problem. The new Primark essentially slips into the shoes of the old Primark without a lot of tension. But if you have dissatisfaction, and it seems there is a rhetoric of dissatisfaction coming out from China to some degree, then you're in the dangerous situation. And again, leave Allison and his cherry picking of ancient Greek history out of it. I'm not talking about that. We're talking about the classical hardcore theory. So would you say that China is dissatisfied? And how do you think China, you're saying the others have to play along, and I don't disagree, but here we're interested in China's policies. How do you think China could potentially change some of its managing of certain issues? Hong Kong, maybe. Taiwan, maybe, without necessarily breaking its red lines, but in a way that, this dissatisfaction a bit gets ameliorated. Because, the rules of power transition are clear. Power transition plus dissatisfaction equals war. So, and I think that a bit covers some of the questions of the students and the other people in there who were talking a lot about Taiwan. It seems to be a big issue, same with Hong Kong as well. Because I think you can agree that there has been a bit of a change in Chinese policy on this issue compared maybe to the previous 10 or previous 20 years before Xi Jinping.
Konstantinos, you are definitely right in observing that China's policy toward Taiwan and Hong Kong has noticeably tightened in the last few years. And the reasons for that actually, I think, has very little to do with China's dissatisfaction. And from the point of view of the Chinese government, and from the point of view, I'm sorry to say, most Chinese people, it is not China, but Hong Kong and Taiwan that are getting dissatisfied. What do I mean by that? And China is not really dissatisfied because Hong Kong is already legally part of China. So what is there for China to get dissatisfied with? And Taiwan, well, China, of course, wants to take Taiwan back, but the Chinese government never says that it wants to take Taiwan back anytime soon. Therefore, I would argue that from the Chinese point of view, and this Chinese includes both the Chinese government and possibly most Chinese people, that it is some people in Hong Kong and Taiwan that are getting increasingly fearful of a rising China and are increasingly dissatisfied with their nominal or submission to Chinese sovereignty. They want to it is those people in Hong Kong and Taiwan that want to change the status quo. Legally, they want to break away from China if they can do it. So therefore, from my point of view, and I believe that most Chinese people would possibly share my belief on this point, is that China's reaction to Hong Kong and Taiwan is more like a reactive defense of what it already has, and not a sense out of a sense of a dissatisfaction with what it has. Because, as I said, China does not need to retake Hong Kong. Hong Kong is already Chinese territory, a part of China's territory. And the Chinese government, at least at this point, never says that it wants, to take Taiwan back anytime soon. So it's more like a reactive assertiveness, I would argue. It's China's reactive assertiveness to prior are provocations, I would say, political provocations for the most part from Hong Kong and Taiwan. And this, I think that my point of view might be different from much of that goes on in the Western news media. But honestly, I think that most Chinese people would possibly share my belief on this point.
There's a question there that I think both of you can address, but especially Dr. Üngör maybe a bit more. It has to do about Turkey's Asia a New initiative. Okay. Somebody asked, is this organized because of the Asia a New initiative? No, it's practically me trying to help a friend get some work out. It's a totally Konstantinos Travlos initiative. But no, I mean, obviously we want to have voices from the world, not just from the West. So it's important. So I will ask first Dr. Üngör if she thinks there's anything to this Asia New initiative that the Turkish government is doing.
Is that question for me? I mean,
it's a general question, but I think it might be one you might answer first, and then I will.
Well, it's very easy to answer this one.
Yeah.
Yes, they invited me. And I actually gave my opinion.
No, I mean, it's like this, first time I heard as well, this Turkish Asia New initiative, if you think it has any real, it's having any real impact on practice, and then I'm going to ask Xiaoting if he thinks China is really interested into clicking into that. So let's start with you, Dr. Üngör, and then to Xiaoting.
Before Asia I knew, I think for the last 10 years or so, there has been growing interest in Turkey, I mean, among Turkish government circles as well, on China specifically and on Asia in general. But I think, and Asia a New initiative, I would call it like an ambition or like a renewed vision, but unfortunately not with a lot of substance. I mean, I haven't really seen a rupture in policy or something really, really important happening after the Asia Anew initiative was launched. And I really don't see practical policy making in the sense that, I mean, it does have difficulties because Asia Anew initiative is like very general. It's very like ambiguous. Yes, there is a willingness to invest more in Asia, to do business with Asian countries, to engage in diplomacy and all sorts of, exchanges. But Asia is not there is this huge continent. I mean, you cannot even bring together in any sense these countries like Central Asian countries. There are geographical divisions. There are economic and political differences. From the level of development to the type of the political regime. And most importantly, some of these countries are, well, very much hostile to each other. How are you going to, I mean, do you see Turkish policymaking, for instance, in terms of balancing between India and Pakistan? I mean, Turkey has been traditionally friendly with Pakistan, but India is an emerging country, right? It's an emerging economy plus a democracy. It's one of the oldest consolidated democracies in Asia. I mean, I'm not saying it's an exemplary democracy. Obviously, under Modi, it's going through a very troublesome time, but it's a democracy nevertheless. And how are you going to make policy satisfying each? Because these are like at opposite ends. And Taiwan and China. I mean, if you blink an eye to Taiwan, China sends, I don't know, reprimands of all sorts. So, I mean, you cannot be friendly with every single Asian country. You gotta choose. And up to this point, I don't really see that kind of specific policy making, really. Yes, we are friendlier with China, but what about the rest of the Asia, East Asia, Southeast Asia? For most Southeast Asian countries, we don't even have substantial relations of any kind. Like we are exporting a little bit, importing a little bit, more importing than exporting, really. But other than that, I mean, do we even have an export on Vietnam? I mean, maybe among you right now in this audience, a young one, but I don't know of anyone.
Thank you so much. Xiaoting, do you want to also add your point? Like, have you heard anything in China about this new Turkish turn?
Actually, I think that I have never heard of, say, the linkages between this Turkish initiative and China's Belt and Road Initiative. But I think that in principle, the Chinese government has always said that the Belt and Road Initiative is actually an open-ended enterprise. That is, any country that wants to join, or any country that wants to make a combination of the Chinese initiative and its own national initiative will be fine, something like that. This is the only thing that I know.
Okay, I'm going to ask you now a question that represents a lot of questions put in the chat. And this is going to be a bit of a pushy question. I apologize, Xiaoting, for it.
Sure.
And okay, I was hearing you talking about the whole Confucian idea that, you know, you need a centralized, strong government in times of countries of transition. I'll be frank. I mean, I'm sure Confucius said something like this perhaps, but this also sounds pretty much like Cold War American doctrine about developing countries, that they need to have central, strong rule, preferably authoritarian military juntas. It reminds me Soviet doctrine and logic, which was essentially that countries that are going through the transition to communism, they might need to have a period of democratic centralism. That was my favorite term. And so on. So my point with this is maybe the Chinese government is presenting this as a Chinese peculiarity because of a culture of many thousand years, no question about it. But what I hear is the same argument made by conservative libertarians and liberals in the United States and the UK, conservatives in the US during the Cold War, Soviet conservatives, which is essentially when a country is in transition, it shouldn't be democratic. And this touches a bit also to the feeling in the West that there has not just been a tightening, and you pointed out how that is interpreted in China. I understand not only a tightening with Taiwan and Hong Kong, but also tightening within China, especially when it comes to access to information, access to dissident, voices and so on. I mean, the feeling is that under Xi Jinping, China has taken a much more defensive, centralized policy, a much more fortress China in a way policy, maybe not in the economic sense, but definitely in the political sense. So, I mean, the problem with this theory is who decides when the development has been completed? Is it going to be the mandate of heaven lost or something? Like, I understand that governments and anybody can say, we don't think this country needs a lot of loosening yet because it's in transition. But who decides when the period is okay for loosening? Is there a discussion in China about this? Is the government saying the transition period will be like this? We will have to have central leadership until then. But you know what? At this end point, then there could be some loosening. Just like the Soviets used to say, we will have to have hardcore democratic centralism until we get to a communist point, and then we can loosen again.
I thank you, Konstantinos, for your astute observations, but I still think that there is a big difference between the Confucian notion of strong central leadership and what you describe and the Cold War notions of strong central leadership. Because in the Confucian tradition, a strong central leadership is not an end in itself. It's always a means to the greater end of ensuring greater are ensuring greater welfare for the society as a whole. So in that sense, I think that, well, the Chinese people, or for that matter, are say the Taiwanese people or the Singaporean people before, or say in the 1960s and the 1970s, they might possibly share very much the feelings shared by the Chinese people today, that as long as the government seems to be guiding the country and the society toward a better future, and as long as there seems to be some reasons to justify the apparent high-handedness of the government, I think that the peoples in those Confucian societies will usually show a high degree of tolerance of such strong centralized leadership. And so this is not just a question of, say, maintaining or grasping at political power just to maintain it. Actually, I think that in Confucian traditions, a strong but wise governor, a strong and wise ruler always knows that, say, the use of power the use of power is not for purposes of private profit or personal aggrandizement, but for purposes of social advancement or something like that. So I think that this is a big difference. And well, this is why I think that the US, well, at least in the 1980s, you can find that the US actually had different feelings about, say, its friends, authoritarian friends in Latin America and in Asia, because apparently the Asian authoritarian governments were apparently doing a lot more better than their counterparts in Latin America. And I hope, of course, that this does not justify, honestly, this does not justify the forever going on of authoritarian government. And nobody knows for sure, honestly, how China's political transformation would come about, at least not at this point. Nobody has any clear notion, not probably Mr. Xi Jinping himself. But one thing I'm pretty sure, that is, in most Confucian societies, our people would show a high degree of tolerance of authoritarian governments, as long as this government seems to be, putting, people's the general welfare above, say, the pursuit of, personal profit or something. I think that this is possibly a unique Confucian characteristic of maybe East Asia. And again, this characteristic cannot be easily replicated in other parts of the world.
Okay, very interesting. It kind of sounds Aristotelian to me, the differentiation between good government and bad government, including monarchy versus dictatorship. So just another ancient civilization mouthing off. We don't have a lot of time. Does anybody else want to ask any other question? And then I'll just ask a couple of questions that are in the chat box. Okay, so there are a couple of questions in the chat box. One is actually asking about how are Turkish studies in China. Do you know, Xiaoting, if there are an interest in Turkish studies in China, are departments opening or something like that?
You mean our apartments that accept?
The departments, like, you know, on Turkish studies. How is the situation? Is there interesting? Are the think tanks or institutes specifically engaged in research in Turkey? How are Turkish studies academically in China?
Possibly not, because I think that they are more likely, say, Middle Eastern studies, so that include a lot of Middle Eastern countries. But not, as far as I know, there is no department that specifically concentrates on Turkey.
And the other question goes back to the South China Sea issue. I think it's the biggest issue for China internationally in a way. Recently, China lost an arbitration court case, and once upon a time, it was talked about putting these claims on a legal basis with the four-shot doctrine. I don't know what the four-shot doctrine is. It's down there in the chat. What is the current UNCLOS policy, or I guess the current Chinese policy towards UNCLOS? And the Vietnam also seems to be having the idea to appeal to arbitration. So how is China reacting or dealing with this policy of the country with which it has a dispute to take it to court? From what I remember with the Philippines case, China just said we don't recognize the results of the court case.
Yes, you're right. You're right. And I think the reason why China declines to participate in the proceedings of this arbitral tribunal are actually, if you look at the documents are related to this case, you will find that the body that made this decision is not a court at all. It's not the International Court of Justice. It's not the permanent court of arbitration. It's only an arbitral tribunal temporarily constituted under the United Nations law of the seas. So China naturally has reason to contest the authority of such a temporarily constituted arbitral tribunal. This is why China does not want to participate at all, because obviously a temporary body, legal body, cannot really be expected to have such power or such legal power over such a vital issue to China. And secondly, I think that as I said, international law contains a lot of contradictions and ambiguities. Therefore, it's not surprising for one country to use a legal loophole in international law against another country. And actually, if you look at the US reaction, you will find that actually some think tanks in the US actually warned the US government not to uphold this case as a legal precedent, because these US think tanks fear that this case against China could be used as a legal precedent against the US in the future as well. So you see, it's not just a question of China declining or rejecting the international court. It's only, say, a case of China contesting the ambiguities hidden in international law. But currently, I think that China's position is still that I own the sovereignty over the islands in the South China Sea, but I'm willing to negotiate a reasonable settlement over the distribution of the fishing and maritime rights. And ultimately, I believe that the distribution of maritime rights possibly matters a great deal more to China and other countries than the ownership of those tiny and usually uninhabitable islands and rocks in the South China Sea.
Thank you so much. Dr. Üngör, do you want to put a final statement?
Well, I thank everyone so much. So many good questions, and the lecture, of course, by Dr. Li. Thank you for having me here, and I enjoyed it. That's my last statement.
Thank you. Dr. Li, any last statement from you?
Thank you very much. And my foremost thanks go to my old classmate Konstantinos, of course. And secondly, I want to thank Professor Üngör for your unusually astute observations on China. Actually, I also learned a lot from your comments. And also my thanks go to Dr. Dennis,
Dennis Erdmann and Ertuğrul, right?
Okay, I don't remember Dennis, and for bringing us all together online. And I really appreciate it. And I look forward to more online collaboration with you in the future, if you want me again.
Yeah, of course. Well, I want to thank everybody for coming. Thank you, Dr. Li, for coming. Thank you, Dr. Üngör, for coming and being the discussant. I think it was an interesting discussion. I want to thank everybody for participating and asking their questions, and especially to thank Dr. Ertuğral, Dr. Erkman for helping organize it, Furkan for helping set it up. I think we're out of time, so we'll finish here. Everybody have a nice rest of the week and stay safe.